Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ron Wilwerding. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this special event, an evening with Ed Meese. It's hosted by Nebraska State Treasurer and our candidate for U.S. Senate, Don Stenberg. I'm standing in for my son, Douglas, who is the Finance Committee Chair for the Stenberg for Senate Committee. Doug's out of town tonight, and he asked me to stand in, which I'll try to do for him. He sends his thanks for all of you coming and wishes you well. He knows this will surely be an interesting and informative evening. It's only appropriate that we begin the evening with the Pledge of Allegiance. And if you'd all stand, I'll lead you in that. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. I'd like now to ask Dr. Phil Kaiser, the pastor of Dominion Covenant Church, to come forward for the invocation.
It's always a privilege to interact with Don Stenberg. I've been following him and enjoying seeing his progress ever since he has been the Attorney General. And of course, Edwin Meese is a hero of mine, so let's pray that God would bless them. Father God, I commit this evening to you. I thank you for the great work that Don Stenberg has already done in the state, and I pray that you would guide him as he seeks another office. I thank you as well for the opportunities that others in this room have had to seek to move this nation back to the Constitution and back to being a nation under God. Father, we live in a time of great crisis, and we need men who will stand for principle, who will have integrity and courage and principled decision-making. I thank you for the wonderful legacy that Edwin Meese has had in our nation and his courageous attempts to bring our nation back to its founding principles. And I pray that the seeds that have been sown by these men, that you would cause them to produce a great harvest to your glory. Please bless the speeches, bless Don Stenberg, Edwin Meese, and each one who has come this evening. I pray this in the strong name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you, Dr. Kaiser. We have some special guests and dignitaries that we need to recognize this evening for their attendance and for their service to our country, for our state, and for our city. I think I'll start out as a proud veteran myself. I'd first ask all the active duty military personnel present and all the veterans to be recognized for your service to our country. Would you please stand? Thank you. We have some dignitaries with us, and if you would, as I call you, would you please stand to be recognized? First, we have Lee Terry Sr., the father of our Congressman Lee Terry Jr. Lee, standing in back. John Sealer, Nebraska Board of Education. John. Scott Peterson, Douglas County Republican Party Chairman. Don. City Council Chief of Staff, Warren Weaver. Our honorary chairman for the Don Stenberg campaign, Governor Charlie Thone, could not be here tonight due to health reasons. Governor Thone served Nebraska as its U.S. Congressman and as our 34th governor. Let us add him to our prayer list tonight, wishing good health and happiness for the future. If you have an opportunity to see Charlie in the near future, wish him well, thank him for his service, and hope that is to both of our state and our nation. Our host for tonight is the Honorable Don Stenberg, currently Nebraska's State Treasurer and previously our Attorney General. Don has 20 years in private sector and 17 years as a public servant. In every position Don has served, and at every opportunity, Don has had to represent the people of the state of Nebraska. He has done so with character, dignity, honor that has always made Nebraskans proud. Don's current commitment to Nebraska is his run for the United States Senate. Don believes, as many of us do, that his record of a lifelong conservative, a seasoned executive, and his proven grounding in the core principles of smaller government, lower taxes, less regulation, and support of family values will bring our nation back to the prominence. Don has tirelessly committed to working on the behalf of all Nebraskans to see that these principles are upheld. We are honored to have Ed Meese, Attorney General under the 40th President Ronald Reagan, with us this evening. Don, would you come forward to formally introduce Ed Meese?
Thank you very much, Ron, for that introduction, and let me convey through you my thanks to your son Doug for doing such a great job for us as our finance chair. We really appreciate his involvement. Let me begin by thanking all of you for your financial support for our campaign. This campaign is about the future of our country, and I'll talk a little bit more about that after Mr. Meese's remarks. But this campaign will be historical in our nation, in my judgment, and there will be those who will be witnesses to history, and there will be those who affect that history. And you here tonight are people who can and will affect the future of our country. So thank you for being here, and thank you for your financial support. As Ron did, I want to make mention of Charlie Thone. He really gave me my first real job in politics. I had a few summer jobs that were interesting in Washington. But he gave me a great opportunity, and it was most appropriate that he be the honorary chair of this event because, as Ed Meese remembers, we talked about it, Charlie Thone was the first governor in the United States to endorse Ronald Reagan for president in 1979. And I was at the news conference where he did that. He had not bothered to tell the staff he was going to do that, so we were pleasantly surprised, and he sure made the right call on that one. Well, I do have the honor of introducing Attorney General Edwin Meese, a truly great American patriot who has had a most remarkable career. Any one of the jobs he has had would be a milestone for any person. He served as Chief of Staff to Governor Reagan when he was Governor of California. He served as Chief of Staff to President Reagan's first winning campaign in 1990. He served as the head of the transition for President Reagan's transition into the office of President. He served as counselor to the President, an office in which he was a key advisor on almost every major domestic policy decision that the President made during that period of time, and then served as Attorney General of the United States. And as someone who's been involved in politics for a long time, I would be honored to have held only one of those offices, and to have done them all is really extraordinary. And I really want to thank Ed Meese for coming here to support our campaign for the United States Senate. I just can't tell you, Ed, how much we appreciate that. I've asked him to at least include some remarks on reminiscences of his work with President Reagan, because it's an extraordinary story, and I think he has some other thoughts he wants to share with as well. So with that, let's give a warm Nebraska welcome to Attorney General Ed Meese.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Don, for that warm welcome, and all of you as well. It's great to be here with you. I was thinking the same thing when both the previous speakers had talked about Charlie Thone, how grateful we were for him back in 1979 when he was kind enough to endorse Ronald Reagan as a governor, because and that was a kind of a star-studded field for the candidacy. People forget Ronald Reagan was by no means an easy nominee of the Republican Party. You had George H.W. Bush, who had been chairman of the Republican Party, ambassador to China, and director of Central Intelligence. You had Howard Baker, the minority leader at that time of the Senate. You had John Connally, who had been governor of Texas and Secretary of the Treasury in Nixon's cabinet. You had, I think Bob Dole was still thinking about it at that time, although he wasn't there quite as long as the rest of them. You had John Anderson, who was a congressman. So it was really a tough fight there in '79 to see who was going to be the nominee in 1980. And it wasn't until actually New Hampshire that things started to turn around. Ronald Reagan had not run actively at the suggestion of his then campaign chairman in Iowa. We all talk about the Iowa caucuses now. There was some thought that Ronald Reagan was, because he'd run in 1976, was in pretty good shape for the presidency, and so his campaign manager thought he should take it easy and that he ought to win in Iowa without working. Well, you don't win election campaigns or caucuses without working. And as Lynn Nofsker, one of our key guys, said at the time, John Sears' strategy for Ronald Reagan was a rose garden strategy. The problem was he didn't have a rose garden. And so Ronald Reagan learned from that, and that's why in New Hampshire he took charge of his own campaign, literally. Ultimately fired his campaign manager and put a couple of the rest of us in charge. But the main thing that I want to say, the reason I mention this, is campaigns are difficult challenges and difficult turning points and difficult tests for the candidates who ultimately, if they're going to be successful, are able to succeed in convincing people that they are the right people to serve the public. And that is not an easy task. And that's why I'm very pleased to be here tonight with my friend Don Stenberg, because he has shown that he has the ability to pass those tests in the past. Winning as your Attorney General here for 3 terms, and then as Treasurer of the state, and he is the person that I personally, if I were a Nebraskan, would like to see serving in the Senate on my behalf. So that's why I'm here tonight. And also, I was asked if I'd talk a little bit about Ronald Reagan during the year that we're celebrating his 100th birthday, and it's always, I never lack an opportunity to talk about Ronald Reagan, because it was such a privilege to work for him over a period of 30 years in various capacities, when he was governor of California, when he was president, when he was a candidate, and in various other ways with his political action committee, and then ultimately helping build his library. And I'm now currently on the co-chairman of his ranch project to keep the Reagan Ranch in a way in which it can be used to teach young people about Ronald Reagan, about what he stood for. Well, this is a great event here tonight, and I certainly, like Don, appreciate all of you coming out and braving the snow. Now, I'm a Californian, and I always say I don't like involuntary snow. Out there, we go up to the snow, we ski, and we go home. But I'm glad to be here with you, and I'm glad that you all braved the snow to turn out this evening. This has been quite a celebration this year of Ronald Reagan. Just 4 or 5 months ago, I was in Budapest, Hungary, and it helped with the dedication of a statue of Ronald Reagan that they put in their Freedom Square in the middle of their capital there to commemorate what he did during the Cold War to give hope to those people who were behind the Iron Curtain. And then, in the same time, during that period of time in the summer, there were similar programs, various celebrations in Poland, in the Czech Republic, and on the 4th of July, a statue of Ronald Reagan was erected in Grosvenor Square in London, in the United Kingdom, to commemorate again what he did in terms of leading the world really against the Soviet Union, winning the Cold War, and so on. So, and also today, I had been there at the dedication, but it was the first time I drove into the Reagan National Airport and saw coming in, as everybody will now, this 1.5 times life-size statue of Ronald Reagan that graces the entrance to Reagan Airport there. So there is a lot of attention given. By now, there are close to 1,000 books written about Ronald Reagan in this country and elsewhere. And it was kind of interesting in the presidential debates recently, those of you who watched them, Ronald Reagan was frequently mentioned. Somebody did a job of counting up the mentions And Ronald Reagan in the 10 debates was mentioned 53 times. The only competition for that were all the other presidents who combined, including Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson, and several others, and they were mentioned a total combined of 38 times. So I guess we could ask the question, why is Ronald Reagan, why is this 100th anniversary so important to so many people, and why is all this attention given to Ronald Reagan? And I'd suggest that there are two reasons. One is the things that he accomplished during his 8 years in the 1980s because of the situation that he inherited and what he did to change the country. And secondly, I think it was his leadership example. He had a lot of the qualities of leadership that attract people and which enable people to follow him. And I'll talk a little bit about that because I think it is important. Now, with this audience here, I think there are at least a few of you who can remember back to 1980. The country was in difficult shape. You remember we had what they called stagflation at the time. Inflation was 12.5%. We had interest rates at 21%. We had unemployment, which was 10.5% ultimately. We had an energy shortage. You had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to get your automobile in line at the gas station because by 8:30 they'd sold out all the gasoline they'd have for that day. And we had a tough economic situation, but we also had a tough national security situation. Our military had deteriorated in the aftermath of the Vietnam War. Those of you who may have been on active duty at that time remember that supplies were hard to come, materiel, and a lot of it had worn out. We were in some ways having a tough time keeping up with the Soviet Union, which was spending a lot of their effort on their military. And we had our position in world leadership was probably at one of the lowest ebbs since World War II. And then even the attitude of the American people. You remember President Carter said that the American people were in a malaise. Well, Ronald Reagan thought that it wasn't the people that were in a malaise, it was the leadership that was in a malaise. And so that's why he ran in 1980 to change things. And indeed, I think, as you can remember back to that time, he brought what I would call true and beneficial change, real change, and turned the country around. He revitalized the economy. You remember, it started the longest period of economic growth, peacetime growth in the history of the country. He rebuilt our military capabilities. That was the period of time when we ramped up in terms of our strategic weapons, in terms of our conventional materiel. But particularly one of the things he did was to make sure that the all-volunteer force worked. Raise the pay of our military people, improve the living conditions, and let the military know that America was proud of them and was behind them. He put Marine Guards in full uniform back, full dress uniform back on the White House, and made a particular point of going around visiting military posts. I had the privilege of being with him on an aircraft carrier off the coast of California, watching the naval maneuvers there, naval air maneuvers at sea. He visited Marine Corps posts, Army posts, every place he could to let the military know. And there's one kind of funny story that you might appreciate, and that was at his first meeting with the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He said they'd gone over what the military strategy was and this sort of thing and some of the problems. And at the end, they were about to leave, and he said, "Gentlemen, could you wait here just a minute?" And they wondered what was going on. And he said, "I've got a personal problem I want to discuss with you." That made him wonder even more. And he said, "Well, it's like this." He said, "When I come off of Air Force One, there's an airman at the bottom, and he salutes sharply. And when I come off of Marine One, there's a Marine at the bottom, and he salutes. When I go on a military post, they're all saluting." He said, "I know if in civilian clothes you're not supposed to return the salute, but I feel badly not acknowledging them." The Commandant of the Marine Corps, who's from Mississippi, said, "Well, Mr. President, I think if you returned the salute, nobody would complain." And if you remember watching Ronald Reagan from that point on, he always returned the salute very sharply, which he knew how to do because he'd been in the military. A lot of people don't realize. And how he got into the military itself is kind of an interesting story about him. He was not very rich. He was poor, actually. And his first job was right out of college. He'd taken him a while to get a job, but he got a job as a radio announcer for WHO in Des Moines, Iowa. And in those days, he was a sports announcer. And he was we were talking about this tonight. He was a pretty well-known sports announcer because the Chicago Cubs was the best-known ball club all through the Middle West. You know, in those days there were no major leagues west of Chicago, so there were not like it is today. And so anyway, he was a sports announcer there, but he wanted to ride horses, and he figured had no way he was going to be able to afford a horse, so he enlisted as a private in the Cavalry Reserve at Fort Des Moines, Iowa, and that's how he learned to ride a horse. Well, he stayed there, and he was always a leader wherever he had been. He was a leader. He was president of his class in high school. He was president of the student body when he went to Eureka College, and so he took these correspondence course lessons that the military reserve had at that time to become a second lieutenant. So when World War II broke out, he was called to duty as a second lieutenant. When they got there, they found out that he'd been fooling them for a few years. One of the things most people don't know about Ronald Reagan, he's had very bad eyes. And when you see him at home, as I did a number of times outside of the public eye, he would have these Coke bottle bottom glasses on to read. But all the rest of the time he used contacts. And but when he was enlisted as a private in the reserve, in those days they weren't too particular. They just had him line up and they looked at an eye chart. Well, he got to the end of the line and memorized the eye chart. So when he got up there, he passed. And well, by the time World War II came along and they had the induction process to call people to active duty, you couldn't fool him anymore, and so they marked him general duty instead of combat. And so that was how he got back to Hollywood, making training films for the Army Air Corps during World War II. But even there, he was a leader. He was the adjutant of his squadron. And so the reason I mentioned that particularly was that leadership experience in the military was the only leadership education he ever had, but it was a very good one as far as he was concerned. And that was a lot of the things he learned which helped him to be a leader later on. He actually learned in the military. Well, it was, as I say, starting in 1981, he revitalized the economy, he rebuilt our military capability and restored our position of world leadership, and he revived the spirit of the American people. In doing this, he displayed what I would call the qualities of successful leadership. First of all, he had a vision. He had an idea of where the country ought to be going. And it was based upon a lot of hard study. He knew about communism because he had been president of the union, the Screen Actors Guild, and worked with the other unions to drive the communists out of Hollywood when they tried to take over the movie industry during the 1940s. And that got him interested in how communism worked, and that gave him an idea of how to deal with the Soviet Union. He had gone, when he worked for GE, he was the host of General Electric Theater, and part of his contract was to go around and visit the various GE plants. And he used to spend the weeks in between the GE theater appearances going around. He visited 137 General Electric plants all over the country and talked with the workers and talked with the managers. And that's how he learned about the economy, how the business and industry worked in the United States, how the economy worked and what the problems were. And so that gave him a vision of what he should be doing as far as the economy is concerned. And so he had this vision when he took office. And he had talked about it all through the campaign during 1979 and 1980, so people had an idea of what he wanted to do. And basically there was two things: revitalize the economy and restore our position in national security. Well, the other thing, the next leadership trait that he displayed, of course, was the ability to communicate that vision and to persuade the American people that that was the right way to go. In other words, to gain adherence to the vision that he wanted to implement as a leader. The third quality that he always displayed was courage. He had moral courage and political courage, and he relied on that courage to do what the right thing was to do, whether it was to support the freedom fighters in Nicaragua against fierce opposition in the House of Representatives, or whether it was right to make the professional air traffic controllers stop them from going on strike, and if those that did strike had to be removed from office because they were violating the law, or whatever it was. But he had the courage to do the right thing. Another thing was his integrity. His honesty and forthrightness even persuaded the Soviet Union, Soviet leaders. Unbeknownst, during the course of the period of time when we weren't having summit meetings in the first 4 years, almost 5 years of his presidency, if you remember, the first 2 years he didn't want to negotiate with the Soviets because of our, at that time, he didn't want to negotiate from a period of weakness, a position of weakness, and we were still had to build up our military. But after about 2 years, he was ready. The budgets were increased, the military was on the way to improving, so he was ready to meet with the Soviet leaders. So he was all set to meet with Brezhnev, who was then the leader, and Brezhnev died. And then Andropov came in, and he was trying to arrange a meeting with him, and Andropov died within a year. And then Chernenkov came, and he died. And the New York Times criticized Ronald Reagan. He said, "You've never had a summit with a Soviet leader." He says, "I try, but they keep dying on me." Finally got a live one in Mikhail Gorbachev, and it was his obvious integrity, I think, that was the main thing that created the bond between him and Gorbachev. Gorbachev knew that whatever Ronald Reagan said he would do, and ultimately led to that treaty, you remember, which took all of the intermediate range nuclear weapons out of Europe when he and Gorbachev came in 1987 and they signed that treaty. And that treaty itself was the sign of another trait that he demonstrated, and that was perseverance. In 1981, he got tax rates reduced, but it wasn't until 1986, after trying and trying, that he actually got tax reform. And it wasn't until 1987 he had suggested this 0-0 option in Europe on these intermediate range nuclear weapons. But the Soviets initially rejected it. He just kept working at it, talking to Mikhail Gorbachev, and ultimately it became a reality in 1987. So those were the kinds of things that, the kind of activities, the kind of person that he was. Now, I often get asked, as people in groups like this talk about Ronald Reagan, they say, what was he really like? What kind of a person was he when you were with him up close? And I've always answered that the most significant characteristic of his personality was his optimism and his cheerfulness. And those of you who watched him on television during the 1980s, I think, will remember that. He was always upbeat in his attitude. There were a lot of tough times during that period, but he always gave hope, and this was true hope, and it was a hope. He always said that America's best days are yet ahead, and he was really had a great ability to do that. As a matter of fact, his cheerfulness was reflected in his legendary sense of humor. I think many of you probably saw in his speeches, he always had some really interesting, humorous accounts. Even when he was talking about the Soviet Union, for example, he was explaining that they were putting all their money into their military to the detriment of their citizens at home. And he illustrated it with these stories that he had heard from people in the Soviet Union, like the one about the commissar. The Soviet commissar goes out to inspect the collective farm, and he says to the manager, "Comrade manager, how are the crops this year?" And the manager says, "Oh, comrade commissar, the crops there are magnificent. Take the potatoes. If you stood them one on one, they would reach to the foot of God." And the commissar says, Comrade, this is the Soviet Union. There is no God." And the manager said, "That's right. There are no potatoes either." That was kind of a typical Ronald Reagan story. The other one he used to tell along the same line to illustrate the same point was about the fellow in the Soviet Union who had saved up his money for almost 20 years to buy a car. Not many citizens had cars. Those were only the officials had cars, but this guy had saved his money. So on the appointed day, he goes down to the bureau where you get the permit to pick up your car and waits in line for 3 hours, because that was pretty common. Gets up to the desk and asks the clerk says, "What do you want?" And he asks him, "I'm supposed to get a permit to buy a car." So the clerk goes back and rustles through a shoebox, finds the permit, brings it to him and said, "Here's your permit. The car will be ready 10 years from tomorrow." And the citizen says, "Will that be morning or afternoon?" And the clerk says, "Oh, what does it matter to you? It's 10 years away." And he says, "Well, I got the plumber coming in the morning." My favorite story, though, my favorite Ronald Reagan story is one that maybe some of you have heard because he told it so many times. He loved to tell stories about the Irish people. He was Irish himself. And he said, nowadays in political correctness, you can only tell stories about your own ethnic group. So he had a lot great fund of Irish stories. One was about the Central Intelligence Agency, and as he told the story, back in the days when the Irish Republican Army was carrying on the troubles against the British in Northern Ireland, they had come to the United States to solicit funds from people of Irish descent here. And so the CIA found out about this, and they figured, well, we better find out what's going on over there. So they looked through their inventory of agents, and they found one named Murphy. They thought that was a pretty good name to send someone to Ireland. And so they brought him in. They said, Murphy, you're going on a covert assignment. Now, covert assignment means you go underground, you get lost in the population, don't take a radio with you, that might give you away, no calls to the United States, no contact with headquarters whatsoever. And when we have a need for your information, we'll send a courier over to debrief you. And they said, and so just so you know it's authentic, there's a password. And the password was, "'Tis a fair day today, but tomorrow will be lovelier." And they figured they could work that into a conversation pretty easily. So off Murphy goes, and 3 months pass, and they figure they better check up and see what he's learned, so they dispatch the courier. Well, the courier's not quite sure where he is, but he's supposed to be in this village. So he goes to the little village where he thinks he might be, and looking for an Irishman, he starts at the local pub. And he orders a whiskey and engages the bartender in conversation. And they talk about the weather, and they talk about the crops, and he says, by the way, I'm looking for a man named Murphy. Well, the bartender says, we got a lot of Murphys around here. If it's Murphy the bootmaker, he's got a shop across the road. If it's Murphy the farmer, he's got a place about 2 miles down that way. And it just happens my name is Murphy too. So the agent casually takes another sip and says, "'Tis a fair day today, but tomorrow will be lovelier." "Oh ho," says the bartender, "you want Murphy the spy. He lives around the corner." Well, you know, spending time with him was always a great pleasure. But I think as we look at our nation today, I think there's a lot of things that Ronald Reagan would be concerned about, and a lot of things that there's good reason for us to be concerned about, because I think we're in serious trouble as a country right now in so many different ways. And this is, in the last 3 years, this has gotten considerably worse. Today I got in the email a chart, and it showed 10 different areas of the economy or of the general civil society in our country. And it showed quantitatively, by statistical numbers, how in each of these categories, whether it was unemployment, whether it was people in poverty, whether it was a shortage of energy, whatever it was, every one of them had gotten materially worse over the course of the last 3 years. And I believe that the polls accurately reflect this, because they show that well over 70% of the public feels that the country's going in the wrong direction. And this is probably the highest percentage that people have felt that way in modern history. And that's why I would suggest to you that the election in 2012 is the most important election we will have had since 1980. And for many of the same reasons, and that is, how do we get out of the problems we're in now? And I think one way we have to do it and look at the election of 2012 is to compare the policies of Ronald Reagan and what happened in the 80s, and then compare what we're doing now and why we need to make a change. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan, in terms of dealing with the economy, made 4 basic changes. Number 1, he reduced tax rates across the board. He didn't believe in this class warfare. He felt everybody should be treated equally in terms of the tax rate reductions. Secondly, he reduced the regulations that were strangling our business and industry at the time, particularly small businesses. Third, he worked with the Fed to have stable monetary policies and to reduce inflation rather than the ups and downs of monetary policy that had been experienced during the 70s. And fourth, he slowed the growth of federal spending so that the increase in federal spending during his 8 years was less than any other president since World War II. Well, those are what was happening then. Today, unfortunately, our current administration is going 180 degrees in the opposite direction. The president can't give a speech without telling how he'd like to raise somebody's taxes. You have the regulations which are imposed, particularly in the first year of the administration, and in things like the Dodd-Frank bill and others, where you have the other similar type of legislation and regulation, which have imposed tremendous costs and tremendous inefficiencies on our businesses, particularly small business. And you have Obamacare, which threatens to have the greatest increase in regulation of the medical situation in our country than we've ever had, imposing mostly, again, on small businesses and on the most vulnerable businesses in our society. And then you have, of course, in terms of the spending and the deficits, we have had a 42% increase in the national debt just in the last 3 years. And so, and the deficits to date in 3 years are greater than the deficits accrued during 8 years during the previous administration. So we have to get back to where we were adopting the policies of 1980. In national securities, in 1980, national security was improved through our concept of peace through strength, building strong alliances, and dealing with our opponents, in this case the Soviet Union, on a moral plane, set why they were wrong, as well as through military, diplomatic, economic, and political means to, in effect, cause them ultimately to implode and to end the Cold War with the West winning. Today, on the other hand, the current administration is diminishing our military strength, cutting our military budgets, not fully staffing what we need to do to win in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and then telling our enemies when we're going to pull out so that they can outweight us and in effect negate what we've been trying to do now in the case of Afghanistan for over a decade. Likewise, we have a president who apologizes for the United States rather than standing up for it, encourages our enemies and unfortunately insults our allies, or adopts policies which actually threaten the continuation of some of our allies in the Middle East. Well, likewise, the policies of Ronald Reagan were devoted to upholding the Constitution, the rule of law, appointing judges who believed in interpreting the Constitution as it actually reads, rather than what is happening at the current time, where even the Democrats refused to approve the judge that was just turned down by the Senate because of her extreme views, particularly on subjects like the Second Amendment and on other similar critical issues of the Bill of Rights. Well, that's why I say 2012 is the most important election since 1980. In 2010, the effort to change the government began with the House being taken over by Republican leadership. And I think Congressman Terry could, if he were here, would certainly be able to explain what a difference it has made to have that House. They are the ones that have put the budgets, have passed the budgets. They have passed the bills. And then the bills have languished because of Harry Reid and the Democratic leadership that is now in the Senate. And that's where the change has got to come. In 2012, we have to finish the job that was started with taking over the House and take over the Senate and taking over the White House. And that's why the election of Don Stenberg is so important, not just to Nebraska, although I'm sure it's important for you to have the person who has proved himself to be a stalwart leader in this state, but it's important to the nation to have him in Washington, D.C., along with the other stalwarts that are there. I know some of you have probably heard of Jim DeMint. Jim DeMint's the leader, really, of the staunch conservatives. And one of the things that I heard, even before I got out here, from Jim DeMint and his staff, was how much he's counting on Don Stenberg to be part of the team that he wants to put together to lead the Senate in a different direction than where it's been. Don, you know what Don stands for. You got the materials on the table. But when I was talking about what Ronald Reagan did, it sounds like the list of things that Don Stenberg is talking about. Cutting taxes, making sure there are no tax increases, dealing with our energy problems, cutting federal spending, repealing Obamacare, securing our borders, no earmarks. Ronald Reagan vetoed a bill because it had 173 earmarks. Today, the bills have literally into the hundreds and sometimes the thousands of earmarks. Other things such as defeating so-called cap and trade, defending our Second Amendment, upholding the Constitution, all of these things are part of the program that he has already committed to you that he would want to implement when he gets to the Senate. In talking with Jim DeMint, he said it's important that we don't just send any Republican to Washington. We need to send Republicans who are committed to the principles, the values, and the policies of Ronald Reagan. And that's where Don is the epitome of what Ronald Reagan stood for. Now, you know his accomplishments here better than I do, although I know a lot of them because we've worked together so closely on a number of issues over the course of the last 10 or 15 years. But what he did for crime control and public safety, for the preservation of life, upholding the Constitution and the rule of law, all of these which are at the heart of the changes that have to be made in the United States Senate. He's demonstrated those personal qualities of integrity, of initiative, of hard work, and he would bring those qualities to Washington, D.C. There are 5 months left until the primary, and then, of course, the real tough work continues all the way down to November of 2012. But I applaud all of you. If you had not already indicated your support, you wouldn't be here tonight. But I think during this 5 months, and then later on in the general election, it's important that all of us redouble our efforts. And also, there are basically three things that absolutely need to be done. One is you've got to talk up the candidacy. Now, in May, a lot of people may not come out to the primary unless somebody tells them why it's important. Primary elections usually have a much lower turnout. And that's why it's important for you to talk with your friends, the people at work, the people in your church, people in your neighborhood, and let them know how critical this election is. Because they're not going to hear it quite the same way from the news media, I suspect. But it is important that they know that it's important they get out. And people who haven't normally gone out and voted in primaries need to get out so that you get the right candidate representing Nebraska in this senatorial election. And then, of course, the next thing to do is to make sure that people get registered, because they can't vote unless they register, and that's an important thing. And then finally, of course, it's to get people to turn out on the day of the election itself, which means an extra effort by people getting them to the polls, calling up, making sure they're voting, and making sure that you have a good turnout on election day, both in the primary and ultimately in the general election. And that's what's going to do the trick. That will do the trick that will enable our country to make the turnaround. It's only going to take a few. It only takes about 3 or 4 changes in the Senate of the right people getting in there to make a real difference of the direction in which our country goes. And I think you as Nebraskans would be awfully proud if you were represented by Don Stenberg, who would make that difference along with Jim DeMint and the others. And that's why I hope you will continue your efforts. I commend you for them tonight. And now I am very proud to call upon our candidate, my friend Don Stenberg.
Well, thank you, Ed, for those very kind remarks and for traveling all the way to Nebraska to be here to support our campaign and share some of your stories about Ronald Reagan. He was a truly great American, and we're just honored to have you here with us. I'm going to be very brief tonight. You may have already seen my 7-point Restore America amendments to the Constitution of the United States, or my 10-point plan to reform federal regulatory system and get the federal government's heavy hand lifted off of American business. I'm not going to go into all of those policy issues, because I want to just take a couple of minutes to look at the country from a much bigger perspective. And that is, right now there are 2 very strongly competing philosophies about what our government should be. And those flow, I believe, from 2 very different views of the American people. And there are those in Washington, and they sit in positions of power today, who look out across America, and they think that most Americans really aren't capable of making good decisions for themselves or for their families. They're not capable of making good financial decisions. They're not capable of making good decisions about their health care. They're not capable about making good decisions about what car to drive or what light bulb to use. And so, that's right. And so, because they see the American people as not being able to make good decisions for themselves, they say, well, the government needs to step in and tell you what kind of light bulb you need, what kind of car you can drive, what kind of health care you must have, what kind of treatment, medical treatment that you can get, and on and on. And that is one view of the American people that is held by President Obama and many others. And that drives a policy agenda of huge deficit spending, of enormous regulatory burdens, of a neglect of the defense of our borders, and on and on. And then there are those of us, and I think it includes everyone in this room this evening, who have great faith in the American people and the American system. That the American people are intelligent, that they care about their families, that they have a religious faith in many cases, and that they are capable of making much better decisions about their personal lives than the government of the United States ever will be. And that drives a very different policy agenda, and it's very much like the one that our founding fathers believed in President Jefferson's first inaugural address. He concluded by describing in a few sentences what a good government is. And he described it as a wise and frugal government that restrains men from injuring one another, but leaves them otherwise free to pursue their own interests of industry and commerce, and which will not take from the mouth of labor the bread that it has earned. That, according to Thomas Jefferson, was the sum of good government. And those of us who believe in the American people believe that is the kind of government that we need to return to. And that means much less regulation. It means a much smaller federal government. It means less federal spending. And those are the two competing philosophies. And they say, well, you know, we've got this gridlock in Washington. We need to compromise. I don't agree with that. I think the American people are going to need to choose in 2012 which direction they want our nation to go. And that will either be the direction of European socialism, which is the path the Obama administration has put us on and wants to continue on, or it will be a dramatic return to traditional American values and a much more limited federal government. And that will be decided in the presidential election, and it will be decided especially in the U.S. Senate elections across the country. Virtually, I'm not a big believer in the political experts, but in this case I believe them. Almost every political expert across the country has said the Nebraska U.S. Senate race is critical to the future of our country in terms of which direction we will go. And the decisions made in 2012, and I agree with General Meese, will set the course of our nation for several generations. And it will either be a nation of more freedom and smaller government, or a bigger government and a socialist government that will end the way that socialist governments of Europe are starting to end right now. This is an incredibly important part in our history. And as I said in my earlier remarks, and I'll conclude with this, there are those, all of us will be witnesses to history. Some of us will be part of making that history. And you, by your presence here tonight, are part of making that history by helping us take this U.S. Senate seat here in Nebraska so that we can return to the vision of our founding fathers that trust the American people to do the right thing. Thank you very much for coming.